the traditional indigenous homeland of the Kalapuya people. Following treaties between 1851 and 1855, Kalapuya people were dispossessed of their indigenous homeland by the United States government and forcibly removed to the Coast Reservation in Western Oregon. Today, descendants are citizens of the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde Community of Oregon and the Confederated Tribes of Siletz Indians of Oregon, and continue to make important contributions in their communities at UO and across the land we now refer to as Oregon. Today, it is an honor to welcome you all to this year's Carroll Lecture delivered by the Benjamin H. and Louise L. Carroll Visiting Professor. We are extremely grateful to Professor Louise Carroll Wade, who founded the professorship in the year 2000 in honor of her parents. I would also like to thank History Department staff, Nick Malum, Phila McWhorter, and Lauren Pynchon, whose work makes it possible for us to host the Carroll Professor in our department this year. Professor Wade was a formidable scholar, a generous donor across campus and in the larger Eugene community, and in retirement, a dedicated teacher in U of O's Osher Lifelong Learning Institute. The Carroll Professorship, whose specific focus is urban history, rotates among the departments of history, political science, and geography. This year, our department is exceedingly lucky to be able to welcome Christoph Rass as Carroll Professor. Without further ado, I will pass the mic on to Professor Julie Wise to introduce our distinguished speaker.
Thank you, Vera. It is an honor to introduce Professor, it's just so nice to see people at an in-person lecture. I'm so happy to be here with you. It is also an honor to introduce Professor Christoph Rass to you. Christoph teaches historical migration studies and modern history at Osnabrück University, where he is a member of the Institute for Migration Research and Intercultural Studies, Germany's oldest such institute dedicated to the study of migration and diversity. And by oldest, I mean it was founded in the 90s, right, Christoph? Which is when some people, but not all people in Germany, began admitting to themselves that migration and diversity would be parts of Germany's future. Christoph received his PhD from the University of Aachen. His first book explored the social history of a Nazi infantry unit, while his second book was the first to comprehensively investigate the emergence of bilateral migration agreements across Europe in the 20th century. He's published dozens of articles. Within the German system of large externally funded research teams, Christoph has led dozens of research projects. His office is like a lab, if you will, with postdocs, graduate students, and undergraduates all collaborating, and often working with teams at other universities as well. The teams he leads conduct research on two main themes: organized violence in the 20th century and historical migration studies. Sometimes, as in our work together on translations of migration, Christoph's work foregrounds methods from cultural studies. Other times, he works with large data sets, such as Gestapo card files, World War II era displaced persons card files, and other forms of big data that can then be mapped onto space, as we'll see in his presentation today. Sometimes Christoph works with archaeologists who use remote sensing techniques to unearth histories of World War II battles or locate mass graves of Jewish victims in Belarus. Christoph is also a deeply engaged public historian, working against current tides in Germany, enabled by the far right, yet manifesting often in the political center, that seek to, quote, move on from the atrocities of the Holocaust, and even rehabilitate certain Nazi figures from that era. His conflict landscape projects bring his teams to engage actively in debates over the memory and memorialization of sites of European violence and mass atrocity. Christoph also works to promote ethnic and immigrant inclusion in German schools, efforts for which he received the Calliope Prize for Migration Research from the German Emigration Center. I first read Christoph's work when I began seeking connections between my own expertise in Mexican migration history and parallel histories in 20th century Europe. As I planned a trip to Germany, my German tutor, Professor Emeritus Helmut Plant, who was helping me read Christoph's work, told me, "When you meet Professor Rass, please ask him to write shorter sentences." When Christoph and I met in Osnabrück, we realized we were asking very similar questions, not about the length of sentences, but about how ideas about post-war labor migration in Europe and the Americas may have connected to each other in ways that scholars confined to their own separate regions had not appreciated. But coming from the US system of the solo humanist, I had no idea then just how fruitful our collaboration would become. The little blob of a baby that was attached to my chest on that visit is now in elementary school. I've gotten to watch Christoph's kids grow up too, and to get to know the other half of the power couple, Seta Turgut-Rass, who lives and makes history with her work in immigrant and refugee resettlement in the thick of social transformations that most of us just read about in the newspaper. As Christoph and I have worked on shared publications and convened an international research group, I've learned so much from him. I've learned not only about European migration history, but just as important, about scholarly collaboration itself, something outside the experience of many of us in the US system. I've witnessed the intellectual growth, the research insights, the novel ideas, and the mutual support that can result from scholars working together rather than going it alone. The projects Christoph will share with us this evening result from just these types of collaborations. We are all so lucky that the Carroll Professorship has brought Christoph to our intellectual community to share his work with us today. Please welcome Christoph Rass.
Thank you very much, and please allow me to step in for the person that you just described as a less perfect version. And thank you all here at the University of Oregon for getting us here. Our kids, my wife Seta and myself, to spend a couple of exciting months working in this tremendously inspiring intellectual climate and this just great place. I'm going to get started here with all the tech, hoping to not push the wrong button. No. Trying to unlock. And here we go. Meine sehr geehrten Damen und Herren, it is my distinct pleasure, and I'm deeply honored to stand here before you in Gerlinger Hall to deliver the 2022 Carroll Lecture as the current Benjamin H. and Lewis L. Carroll Visiting Professor in Urbanization. Being an historian, I've done my research on Professor Carol Wade, the donor of this professorship, to understand my place in her legacy. I learned, to my surprise, that we did have a mutual academic acquaintance in Professor Roger Chickering, who honors the occasion with his presence. I learned much about how migration mobility shaped the history of Professor Carol Wade's own family from her account of 5 generations of Carrolls that you can find in Knight Library. Chicago's Pride, Professor Wade's seminal book on the life in the meatpacking district in the second half of the 19th century, and also her first book on Graham Taylor as a social reformer, I learned a lot. Then introduced me, if you care to take a look later on, then introduced me to a colleague with a strong sense for a well-reflected translation of the past's echoes in a historical account, situated in primary material and its careful interpretation. I wondered what Lewis Carroll Wade would have had to say about the technology we use today to dig into the history of social change even deeper. I also asked myself what she would have made of a German social historian working in the Wählerian tradition of social science history. I hope we would have engaged in a fruitful debate. It is a privilege to contribute as a visiting scholar in the name of Benjamin H. and Lewis L. Carroll at the University of Oregon to the inquiry of urban history, to interact with colleagues from the departments of history, geography, and political science, to advance in collaboration with Professor Julie Weiss from the Department of History the study of migration politics, and to teach a class with brilliant students at this school, some of which came today, which honors me deeply. Cities, in different ways than rural spaces, are building blocks of societies, the powerhouses, incubators, the places where life is real, and the spheres into which larger processes translate, where change is felt and often generated. Cities are the stages on which we negotiate how our societies have been, are, and will be. This lecture will introduce 4 aspects of my work. The work I do with my research group at the University of Osnabrück and the Institute for Migration research and intercultural studies. We will in this focus on the city of Osnabrück itself. As historians, I feel we are, after all, called also to always dig where we stand. The themes for this lecture are, number one, the production of surveillance and terror as Germany transformed itself into the Nazi Volksgemeinschaft between 1939 and 1945. Number two, the path of Germany towards an increasingly diverse society through migration. Number three, the presence and impact of contemporary information technology and the consequences of the card file index revolution. And number four, the use of digital methods to understand indices as complex primary sources yielding historical big data. We will discuss two of my current research projects titled Surveillance, Power, Order. That sounds in German like surveillance makes order. On the card file information system of the local Gestapo and foreigner registers as sources of data-driven models of migration-induced urban diversity. On migration to Osnabrück from 1930 to 1980. What I present today is part of a broader research and public history program on Osnabrück I do with my team. And please allow me to fly them in for a second to introduce you. This fabulous group of researchers that work with me at the Chair of Modern History and Historical Migration Studies at the moment. So you've been introduced. Our series of projects on Osnabrück includes a study of the local impact of World War I, the beginning and the end of democracy in 1919 and 1933, the production of power and transformation by the Gestapo, the persecution and murder of the local Jewish community, the presence of forced laborers and POWs during the war years, followed by the presence of refugees and displaced persons up to the integration of former DPs as heimatlose Ausländer into West German society. The rise of a regional Nazi party during the first post-1945 elections, yes, that's at the beginning of the 1950s, and the change of Osnabrück through migration and diversity since the 1950s, and the local struggle to overcome homophobia, to name some of our themes. We look at local institutions and their role in shaping the city for better or worse. We look at marginalized groups and places to bring them back into history. And we keep a critical eye on the production of local narratives and historical figures, especially concerning continuities between the Nazi period and post-war Germany. We also work with local memorials to support a critical and reflexive culture of memory. Now let me take you to Osnabrück, a city west of Münster, south of Bielefeld, between Cologne and Berlin, close to Bremen, somewhere in northwestern Germany. Oh, that was fast, right? Now let me get that for you with a bit more of sunshine. Osnabrück is known for the peace negotiations of 1648, branding itself a city of peace. For the local thinker of the Enlightenment, Justus Möser, the painter Felix Nussbaum, murdered in Auschwitz with almost his entire family, and the pacifist writer Erich Maria Remarque, driven into exile by his fellow citizens in 1933 to eventually become a citizen of the United States of America in 1947. Osnabrück is a very average town, about the size of Eugene, bestowed with the same telephone area code as Eugene, 541, and two universities, both dating from the 1970s, a full century younger than this place. A survey found about 20 years ago that people living in Osnabrück were the happiest in the entire country. I cannot explain that. But that is exactly what makes studying a place like this so interesting. Even taking into account the specifics of each place, cities like Osnabrück, the small, large towns, centers of business, administration, and politics, the garrisons and transport hubs of Germany, are far more typical than the metropolis. Osnabrück, this is Germany for you. In its taciturn, northern German, maybe even Westphalian, self-imagined, mixed Catholic Protestant style. It's a fascinating spot with many great people. Let us enter the city on the path of Teresa and Giulio Beltrami, who came to Osnabrück at the turn of the 20th century. Maybe the large infrastructure projects, the Northern Canal system, or the many large barracks which attracted many Italian construction workers and masons, brought the Beltramis to Osnabrück. Julie had been born in Modena in 1872 and later married Teresa, who was from Presseri, close to Udine. In 1905, the couple settled in a working-class neighborhood in Osnabrück-Eversburg. Both their daughters, Matilda and Sophie, were born before the First World War in Osnabrück as citizens of Italy, as demanded by the German ius sanguinis. They would, like their parents, spend their whole lives in this town. Like so many, the Beltramis left no extensive paper trail, files or personal papers that we are aware of. Nonetheless, we can follow them from the early 1900s to present day, with the fourth generation living in Osnabrück-Peie, right where their great-grandparents once settled when they first arrived in Germany 120 years ago. We encounter the Beltramis based on data generated by municipal administration as part of their attempt to trace every inhabitant of Osnabrück with a mighty new tool, the card file index. Card file indices were introduced to Germany, to its administration, in the late 1920s and triggered what we call the card file index revolution. It shaped, albeit today in digital form, the modern administrative practice of population registers, a vast network of data collections all across Germany. The first card of the Beltramis was created in the early 1930s, when a clerk collected all the data required back to 1905. We learn from the cards that initially, things seemed to go well for the family during the economic boom of the years before 1914 and even into the first post-war years. But in the late 1920s, the Great Depression sent the family on a downward spiral. They were forced to give up their apartment, move to Peie, a rural village in Osnabrück County, and later to a homeless shelter. The Papenhütte was a bunch of rundown buildings, shacks rather, close to the canal harbor on the outskirts of town, where the city dumped vagabonds and homeless people and provided housing for those who had become a public charge. The cards further inform us that Teresa Beltrami died at the Papenhütte in 1937. In 1934, her daughter Sophie, who was working as a maid, had been impregnated out of wedlock by an unknown father at the age of 21 and had given birth to her daughter Brigitte. Brigitte was raised by her aunt Matilda and her grandparents, who picked the baby up from hospital. Sophie later married a German, that was in 1939, which made her the first German citizen of the family. And she had two more children, one before and one after the wedding. Both infants died in the town's hospital at a very young age, in 1942 and 1943, only weeks before her mother died of tuberculosis at the same hospital, aged only 30. When the Beltramis lived at the Papenhütte, the most marginalized, despised, and poor place in town, the neighborhood was not of interest just to the alien police. Their address also began to appear in the index of the local Gestapo, which had the Papenhütte under constant surveillance. The Gestapo also pondered the idea to turn what had started as a social housing project in the Weimar Republic into a local concentration camp by just fencing it in. The Gestapo was worried about enemies of the Volksgemeinschaft. The rundown buildings where the Beltramis had found a room to stay were harassed as they harbored not only former communists, but also the local Sinti community, who was forced to live at the Papenhütte. Like members of the Imker family, all Sintetze from Osnabrück were deported to Auschwitz from there in May 1943. All 8 members of the Imker family named on these 2 cards were murdered in the same year. Maria, Gertrud, and Adelheid, their baby brother Konstantin, and Maria's husband Wilhelm lived right next to the Beltramis. None of them survived the German genocide of the Sinti and Roma people. While the Beltramis, impoverished Italian immigrants, lived at Papenhütte side by side with the Imker family and the marginalized communist sympathizers, Matilda Beltrami met her future husband right there. Klamor Lienemann was a communist organizer who had first been a person of interest to the Prussian police and then to the Gestapo. They kept him under surveillance throughout the 1930s when he had moved to the Papenhütte and raided his apartment several times. Later, as documented on his residence register card, he was put into a Wehrmacht uniform and sent to war. He survived, returned to Osnabrück, divorced his first wife, and finally married Mathilda. Brigitte also survived the war as an upgrowing child, living with her extended family, as did her grandfather Julio. Mathilda and Beltrami led quiet lives in the post-war Osnabrück, slowly moving into lower middle class and upper working class neighborhoods. Brigitte's children still live in Osnabrück today. Julio passed away in 1956, aged 84, after spending the first 28 years of his life in Italy and the remaining 56 years in Germany. He died an Italian citizen. His last address in town is about 1,000 yards from the place in Osnabrück-Eversburg he had moved to 50 years earlier when he arrived with his young wife. Before the Second World War, however, Osnabrück had virtually been a German city. There were almost no foreigners or aliens living in town as registered inhabitants. The only other Italian registered as Osnabrück before the First War was Angelo Toscani, who came to town in 1908, age 24, to make and sell ice cream. And he also stayed in Osnabrück until he died in 1955. The world was visiting and passing through at the time, but only very few international migrants settled down. And be sure, no immigrant who did settle down, like the Beltramis and the Toscanis, would be accepted and recognized as belonging to the German nation. Julio and Angelo were kept in the foreigners register all their lives, and Osnabrückians like them are largely not present in local historiography at all. The Second World War ushered then in the exact opposite of what the Nazis had imagined their Volksgemeinschaft to be. The forced labor system brought thousands of recruited and deported people from all over the Nazi empire into town to work in the war industry. Some stayed after liberation, while more refugees and displaced persons arrived. Many of them would settle and integrate during the 1950s. Around 1955, the arrival of labor migrants began. Guest workers, Gastarbeiter, another term first popularized by the Nazis. They came from Italy, Spain, Portugal, Turkey, Greece, and other countries to drive the economic miracle. To quote Klaus J. Bade, the founder of EMIS, this denied immigration fundamentally changed German society. Step by step, we became the diverse migration society of today. In 1930, about 0.1% of Osnabrück's registered residents were without German nationality. In the early 1950s, it would be about 3%. In the mid-1960s, 4%, and 8% a decade later in the mid-1970s. Today, about 15% of the population in Osnabrück have no German passport, but more than 30% experienced international migration in their immediate family histories. They have what we clumsily call a migration background, Migrationshintergrund. Julio Beltrami may have witnessed the arrival of the first workers from Italy in his neighborhood in the mid-1950s. But whereas the Beltramis stayed invisible in the dominant narrative, the next generation of migrants from Italy were made visible, but only in stereotyped social roles assigned to them by German society. Only a few years later, after Julio Beltrami had passed, Filippo Ercolani came to Osnabrück, aged 22, born in Gradoli, Italy. In Osnabrück, everybody knows him today. Why? A much popularized picture shows him arriving at Osnabrück main station, a bottle of wine in his hand. The caption in the local history museum states, "The first Italian carman worker arrives." The message here is, he came not to stay. And of course, a bit of wine helps the male migrant from southern Europe to overcome homesickness. But Filippo Ercolani behaved in entirely unexpected ways. Only nobody paid attention, because he had already been labeled a Gastarbeiter, guest worker, and had been assigned his position in the narrative. However, Ercolani just stayed briefly in a collective housing facility for migrant workers. Then he married Helga Schittli, a German woman from Hamburg. The couple had 2 kids born as Italians due to their father's nationality. The family settled down in Osnabrück, and the parents made sure both kids got German citizenship very early on. Filippo Ercolani would still be called a Gastarbeiter, guest worker. and get reduced to that label while settling down as an immigrant. He became an Osnabrücker by all means but his recognition. The first guest worker was an immigrant. The Beltramis and the Ercolanis are just two cases. Their cards in the Central Foreigners Index represent half a dozen of 56,613 cards just for the city of Osnabrück from the period between 1930 and 1980. This section of the index holds information on 70,000 individuals moving to or from Osnabrück or changing address or being born within city limits, all foreign nationals. And each German town has just such a register. The entries documenting the Gestapo raids at the Papenhütte and the harassment of Clara Lindemann, the communist organizer and husband of Matilda, are embedded in information on 48,015 people from the city, the governorate of Osnabrück, and all across the Nazi sphere, collected as part of the local Gestapo manhunt system. Each sector of the Gestapo had its own index. Today's infamous Ausländerzentralregister, the central index of foreigners in Germany, which is still in use, is a direct great-grandchild of a Gestapo index combining its surveillance logic with a tracing system of the municipal foreigners registers. Let us pause here for a bit and think about where these indices came from. Card indices became popular during the 18th century to organize knowledge. Encyclopedias were written with them, and libraries built their catalogs using them. You have dozens of old-fashioned card file catalogs preserved in Knight's library. Then, German police forces began to use card file systems to manage registers of suspects and develop their identification and manhunt protocols. In Germany, the push for modernization and efficiency during the interwar years introduced card file indices to the administration at large, all the way from top to bottom, from Berlin to the local level. This reform came in full force. Around 1928, card file index systems were installed in municipalities to replace the old residence lists and household books. And the new indices were not designed to take a snapshot every other year. They were planned to constantly collect information on every citizen and have this information readily available at the administration's fingertips. After local administrations had converted their general registers, they set up separate registers for foreigners to collect data on every non-national residing in town and town and town and town and the entire country. Local indices often corresponded with central systems, which merged the local data. The larger the indices grew, the more labor-intensive they became in upkeeping and in using them in practice. A couple of clerks and secretaries Karteikräfte would do the job in Osnabrück. But the enormous central indices with millions and millions of cards were later operated by thousands of staff, entering and retrieving data simultaneously. The Wehrmacht would create 100 million entries in its central tracing system and 17 million cards in its Z-index, amassing up-to-date information on each and every man under arms. The Nazi Party kept a 12.7 million card index on its members. To be sure, the Germans were not early movers in collecting data on foreigners. When Belgium became an independent nation a full century earlier, the Sûreté began creating a file on each foreigner residing in the country, and they still do. Given its very liberal migration regime in the 19th century, with virtually no restrictions to settle, the state wanted to be sure to know everything needed to execute the flip side of that, easy deportations. But Belgium never created an index and ended up with a rather clumsy system. The idea of the index is different. The index was meant to focus on information deemed essential for its purpose and work very, very fast. At the same time, it served as a very efficient key to more extensive as the card file index, thank you, of the Prussian secret police when democracy in Germany was under attack. The Prussian Department of the Interior gave orders around 1928 to set up a card file index in all police districts to keep watch over political activities threatening the state. For the first 4 years of its existence, the Politische Polizei in Osnabrück collected surveillance data on the Communist Party and the Nazis alike in its index. An analysis we just completed unveils that the Osnabrück branch did a fairly reasonably balanced job. In 1933, radical change occurred. Those who had been the objects of police surveillance became the masters of the system. The Nazis took over the police, and things changed from one day to the next. The Gestapo began to target everyone deemed a threat or unfit for the Volksgemeinschaft with its most potent tool, the index. A handful of officers and office staff were able to build and manage a large information machine and act targeted based on its use. Whichever group or person came into its crosshairs and got cards in the index had a much increased chance to keep meeting the Gestapo. Let me illustrate that with an example. The Prussian police had put intense surveillance on Erich Pürweg from 1929 to 1932. He was a very active local communist organizer in Osnabrück, and the police had much to say about him. He gave speeches, set up meetings, put up posters, but they let him be. After all, he was nonviolent and just exercising his civil rights. When the Gestapo took over, all of that changed. Pürweg was harassed, arrested, interrogated, deported to a concentration camp, even though he seemed to have become a lot more cautious after January 1933. And the pressure would be kept on him even after he was released from the Emsland camp at Esterwegen. The Gestapo triggered the denial of social benefits to his family and used a pretext to throw him into prison for 4 years during the later 1930s. Pürweg survived and later returned to Osnabrück. Who was booked into the Gestapo index system became very visible to the regime, and its henchmen were able to locate and apprehend entire groups quickly. Priests and clergymen, communists, socialists, individuals deemed antisocial. Any new definition of a target or threat the Nazis came up with created more entries. The Jewish citizens of Osnabrück, represented here as part of the Stolpersteiner Memorial, did also get their own set of cards. First, as part of the more extensive index, then in a specific Judenkartei. Their cards were later destroyed, probably after the deportation. The Gestapo closed the case. The Shoah is mirrored here in administrative practice. Osnabrück was cleansed, judenfrei. The index cards of those deported to be murdered would not longer be needed. A central data point documenting that they ever existed, documenting their persecution and their murder, was simply erased. And the learning process itself would prove to have deadly consequences. In the Netherlands, a similar population register had become so efficient that the German occupiers, knowing about the power of central registration systems, easily plugged into the system, still run by Dutch clerks, swiftly located most of the Dutch Jews when the order for deportation came, using a perfectly tuned data machine. The Netherlands has the highest rate of murdered Jews in Western Europe as a consequence. What happened in Germany, the advent of the fully fledged and most extreme version of the German Polizeistaat, police state, did, however, not remain unnoticed at the time. The very specialist who helped plan and implement the card file index reform in the Weimar Republic, Dr. Robert Kempner, was ousted by the Nazis in 1933 for being Jewish and an unflinching Democrat. He escaped to exile and arrived in the USA as a refugee in 1939. Being an expert on German administration bureaucracy, he prepared a massive study for the US government to help prepare the occupation regime. That study was then summarized by top analyst and later diplomat Robert Strauss-Hupé, himself also an immigrant, and then at the University of Pennsylvania. and signed off in 30 copies, classified confidential, by Henry Field, anthropologist to the US president, and head of the secret M project on post-war resettlement of refugees. The summary gave a detailed account on the entire Nazi universe of lists and indices. It exposed its depth and broad coverage, interconnectedness, and vertical as well as horizontal integration. But it also pointed out its hybris, manifest in the attempt to track, classify, record, and control everyone, to have data machines that worked so fast that their output could be used to make day-to-day decisions. Kempner's original study stressed how well the system would work to track down Nazis and war criminals and help destroy any Nazi underground network after the war. How important it would be to keep the machinery and its engineers in place as a core of German administration, and how important the registers and indices would be to the Allies to, quote, administer, regulate, and control population movements, recruit labor, restrict travel, expel undesirables, and dissolve subversive organizations. Dr. Kempner himself went on to work as deputy to Robert H. Jackson and found and secured the Wannsee Protocol in 1947. Having the same expertise as Dr. Kempner, the keepers of the indices in Nazi Germany, the perpetrators, knew very well that their data sets would turn against them as the most detailed record of their crimes. Gestapo card file indices existed everywhere in Germany. Every major town with a Gestapo office had one, but only 5 out of hundreds survived the war. One of them was discovered in the destroyed offices of the Osnabrück Gestapo headquarters, which, by the way, were located in the town's castle in the city center, of course. The very same building is the main building of my university today, and the Gestapo holding cells are still in our basement, underneath HR, converted into a memorial. To us, it was a major surprise to come across the original cards in a basement file storage of the state archives, and an even bigger surprise to gain permission to digitize the whole lot. And while we were at it, I inquired about another index I saw down there. Archivists pointed out that was the old Ausländermeldekartei, the Foreigners Index, and permitted me to digitize the cards up to 1980 as well. Then we came across a third, even larger, a more extensive index in the vault. That one, we were told, was the index of German residents from 1929 to 1980. And we did not get permission to work with those documents due to data protection. How then does digital and data-driven history approach a card file index? Let me briefly explain the workflow. We had all the cards scanned in high resolution, then worked with an external service provider, which trained an AI-enhanced algorithm that works well with highly structured documents to convert the information on the cards into a machine-readable format. Then we organized the output in a relational database which mirrored the structure of the original card file index. Within about 3 months per index, this resulted in a fully digital and machine-readable double of the original index. The precision of character recognition for typewriters and handwriting alike was about 98%. We then geocoded the address data in both indices and began the analysis. On the last leg of this lecture, I would like to briefly discuss some of the results from our work, based not just on information on selected individuals, but on the entirety of the data. Let us turn to the Gestapo dataset first, with 2 brief examples. Analyzing the digital model of the index has yielded the first observations ever of how such an index grew. Between 1928 and 1933, the Prussian police had created about 1,300 cards, roughly 4% of the entire index. Between 1933 and 1936, the growth accelerated. Then, the Gestapo Act, a law of 1936, triggered exponential growth. This law empowered the Gestapo to monitor and persecute literally everything. But the busiest period in terms of card production was yet to come after 1941, when the Gestapo was mainly charged with keeping millions of forced laborers under control, and was at the same time disciplining a society under the pressure of war. Then the steepest increase occurred. On March 26, 1945, March 26, 1945, a Gestapo officer administered the last entry on a Dutch foreign laborer, forced laborer named Johannes Schwerkman, who had been sent to the local Gestapo-run labor camp. A week later, the British Army took Osnabrück without much fighting. During this last week, the Gestapo decided the war was lost and destroyed much of its files, probably burning them in the castle's courtyard. But they forgot their index. The number of cards is, however, just half the story. Each card could contain several entries on the person of interest: observations, actions, reports, sentencings, etc. The growth in entries on the cards shows an even more detailed picture. The sharp increase from 1935 to 1936 looks even more extreme. The Gestapo, empowered by the new 1936 law, drowned itself in more data than it could handle. Officers had to learn how to use their newly unleashed powers. In 1937, the number of entries normalized before the impending war seemed to require tightened control. The increase of entries in the pre-war years was due to ramping up the manhunt system rather than local events. Then, policing the forced labor system led to an increased activity in Osnabrück, now based on an indexing system the Gestapo had thoroughly mastered. In 1943, they created 4,000 new cards, and the system did not show any sign of overheating. 1936, however, points out that the index does not just mirror direct Gestapo action, but also changing modes of data production. We were able to time and geocode about 39,000 of the 41,000 entries on the cards to better understand where, when, and how the Gestapo went into action. To give you an idea about the macro perspective, we can, for the first time really, take a look at what the Gestapo did, not based on their periodical reports, which were an interpretation of the data, but on their own raw data log, which is of course also a construct, but on a different level. While you have a look at this dynamic map focused on the city of Osnabrück, and while you're watching, remember each dot represents Gestapo action linked to an individual. The index mirrors the Gestapo doing three things. It registered people to mark them as targets. It recorded surveillance measures and also low-level warnings like visitations. And it created a protocol of more severe actions, from intimidation to social exclusion, arrests, or harsher punishments like sending victims to concentration camps or simply execution. There were a lot of practices on the lower levels that brutal beatings and arrests, which often escape researchers' attention. Letting people know that the Gestapo watched seemed to have been a vital tool to create a constant atmosphere of fear. After all, their targets was not just the victims, but everyone. All received a message by the punishment of a few. The atmosphere in town and subsequent compliance thus probably was the most critical product of the Gestapo's work. Zooming to the entire governorate of Osnabrück reveals complex spatial patterns in the chronological model. During the last Weimar years, the Prussian political police built the index very much focused on Osnabrück and the smaller towns in the governorate. The Gestapo stuck to that pattern from 1933 to 36, albeit on a much heightened level of activities. Between 1937 and 1941, Gestapo surveillance then covered the whole governorate. Far-reaching surveillance and interaction were fully fledged and established. From 1941 to 1945, the focus shifted back on the municipalities, the urban parts of the German war society, a Volksgemeinschaft under pressure, and the industrial cores where the Gestapo policed the forced labor system. Zooming back in to the city of Osnabrück exposes this in even more detail. During the first years after 1933, the Gestapo worked like the Prussian police, but looked at different places in town. Nazi strongholds were out of the picture. 1936 marks the extreme expansion of surveillance while the Gestapo retooled their system. From 1938, they had mastered it and executed intense surveillance and action very efficiently. During the war, the spatial focus in town shifted very much towards the larger industrial sites and the camps for forced laborers. At the same time, the clerks over at the Ausländerpolizei, alien police, kept their index up to date and registered thousands of forced laborers. What does their data tell us about migration and social change in town? At first glance, the data seems to tell a well-known story about migration to Germany. A closer look, however, points out what the established narratives miss. We were, for example, able to show that far more displaced persons stayed and settled in Osnabrück than anticipated, and that they were far more diverse in terms of origin. Note the large number of DPs from the Baltics. We will get back to them in a minute. Osnabrück also became a designated center to collect disabled displaced persons, physically or mentally disabled. That was decided by the International Refugee Organization. These groups in the DP population were hard to place in overseas resettlement programs. Nobody wanted them as immigrants. When in 1951, the homeless alien, heimatlose Ausländer, became a new category to settle this DP hardcore in Germany, local authorities registered more than 1,000 remaining DPs for permanent settlement in Osnabrück. We also found hundreds of former Waffen-SS men from Latvia, members of the Latvian Legion, who were granted DP status against IRO regulations. The Allies tended to see them as idealists fighting the right enemy on the wrong side. But the veteran legionnaires were often reluctant to enter resettlement, afraid of the screening for collaborators during immigration. Many stayed in Germany. And one of their strongholds was Osnabrück, where we located a group of several hundred, among them high-ranking staff officers of the former Legion. They managed to almost hijack the civil labor corps of the British Army of the Rhine, which employed nearly 100 of them in Osnabrück as armed guards and service personnel. After all, those ex-legionnaires, they looked good and they had proper military training. At the same time, a Jewish organization had created a station in town located in the burned-down building of the old Jewish school next to the demolished synagogue. It provided shelter to Jewish survivors from the large Bergen-Belsen DP camp, many of whom were on their way to Palestine or to other overseas destinations. Dozens of survivors passed through town, which points out how early survivors organized, not just within the DP camp infrastructure, but also on their own, as early as late 1945. Note how the local authorities still called the Bergen-Belsen displaced person camp a KZL, Konzentrationslager, a concentration camp, and how any reference to the registered foreigners listed as Polish nationals with Jewish as their religious affiliation, being survivors of the Holocaust, is missing. Neither the case of Nazi collaborators establishing themselves with the Allies, nor Jewish survivors of the Holocaust using Osnabrück as a waypoint for emigration is documented in any other files. All we have are seemingly random data points. In isolation, they mean little. Connected, they turn silence into voice. Taking into account all the data points in the model leads to this dynamic visualization of 66,111 moves to Osnabrück and 99,264 changes of address within the city limits across 10,700 addresses in town between 1920 and 1980. It represents the dynamics of 5 major phases. Up to 1939, there were virtually no migrants living in town. Then, the forced labor system sets in. Refugees and displaced persons follow. Then come the labor migrants. And finally, their families arrive. Of course, there are dozens of smaller groups and movements surfacing in the data, which I have no time to talk about right now. It may seem unspectacular, but it is proof that post-1945, Osnabrück turned a lot more diverse, with a further spread of newly arriving non-national inhabitants across town in more complex patterns than the local narrative acknowledges, which sees Ausländer, foreigners, confined to certain neighborhoods and quarters, and in pre-translated and pre-translated and stereotyped social roles. Osnabrück really was a very diverse city very early on. Hidden in the picture are also infrastructures that have all vanished from the cityscape and from local memory. The camps and the collective housing facilities. We've identified dozens of facilities, often in the same location across time, many of whom had not been documented so far. The oldest layer is the camps for forced laborers. The sandwich layer is the refugee and displaced person camps of the post-war years, and on top of them came the housing facilities for labor migrants. The largest of those facilities for guest workers existed from the early 1960s to the late 1970s, far longer than anyone had them on the books. We were able to document about 4,500 migrants who lived there. The site was located on the edge of the old city center, about 1,000 yards from the castle. The inhabitants, all male, were almost entirely recruited from Spain and Portugal and worked for the Karmann automobile company. The camp, which was put into a converted production hall, had large dorms for about a dozen people each, with kitchens and sanitation rooms built into them. It was located right in the production plant where the migrant workers built cars. What did it mean to the neighborhood to have a massive housing facility for Spanish migrants, about 400 to 600 at any one time in its midst? What did it mean for thousands of migrants to arrive at Osnabrück through such housing facilities? Today, the plant is gone. And so is any trace of the large guest worker housing facility. New urban flats stand in its place across the street from a large student dorm. The migrants' legacy is erased from Osnabrück's history. Many of the Spaniards remigrated after the end of the Franco regime. Others settled in town. Today, Osnabrück is a city devoted to create equity for all citizens, to doing its bit in helping refugees, and to being a welcoming and inclusive place to live. The town has created a vivid culture of memory. A museum is dedicated to Felix Nussbaum. A peace center bears the name of Erich Maria Remarque. The Gestapo headquarters are a memorial. A place is named after Yilmaz Akürek, an immigrant from Turkey and an early activist on behalf of migrants in town. A prize is awarded every year in his name. Stolpersteine mark each place in town from where a victim was deported when Osnabrück was a Nazi city. Central memorials at City Hall are dedicated to the murdered Jews and the murdered Sinti. A sign points out where the Papenhütte once was. But there remains much to be done, and it stays a struggle to prevent revisionism from slipping in, to keep bringing marginalized people, voices, and places back into our history, and challenge the all too convenient narratives of who we are. In Germany, I believe historians must work where it hurts. And history keeps being negotiated. A lot remains to be said, but I have
questions for our speaker after that wonderful talk. So go ahead and raise your hand, and after that, we'll be able to chat more informally at a reception. Yeah.
Well, I think we have to first, I need to speak in the microphone. Now I have it this way, I'm probably going to begin singing. So, first of all, I think we need to sort of get a catalog of the different counting practices and datification practices of the state. So, taking censuses is one thing, keeping lists, up-to-date data on things or on people is another thing. So when a census is taken, there's a sea of data created. And most of the time, then there's very specific statistical tasks to be done with that paper. And it takes, before the digital times, it takes years and years and years and years. And once this work is done, nobody ever gets back to the original data. Right? This only happens now that we can digitize this. Last week, the 1950 census of the United States went online, and I can't wait. And to call my people back home and say, well, download it. So before that, once the data is collected in its lowest form, the least aggregate form, there's a statistical aggregation process, and then everybody works with the statistics. Right? Most of the time, the underlying data gets destroyed. For none of the censuses in Germany, the older ones, the original collection, how do you call them? The collection sheets are preserved. There's one in the? Like enumeration sheets. Yeah, the enumeration sheets. Because we have the statistics now, we don't need them anymore. We can save shelf space, just burn the lot, right? Only Lower Saxony has taken the pain to keep the first post-war census with all the collection sheets in its archives. And they call me like once a month and say, well, can we do something about it with, this? And yes, of course we can digitize it all. It's just going to be a lot more expensive than doing the card file index because you have millions of these more complex. So the census is taken, but the census really produces a statistic, and then all the underlying data dies in a way, right? In day-to-day administration, something else happens. To keep track of your inhabitants in town, for tax purposes and what have you, the Germans will write lists. And lists are, we love keeping lists, but lists are not very practical to update. Right? You keep writing lists and they accumulate, and historians in a way hate them as well. It's very hard actually, not just to work with them as historians, but it's also hard to work with them as a bureaucrat. They come up with different systems. For instance, in Hanover, they have house books. So they take lists apart and they assign a little folder to each house because they think, well, we have a geographical pattern now, the topography of town, and we can more easily retrieve and enter data. And as you keep these books, they get more complex again, and it's really... So what happens is the card file index replaces all the list writing, because every item, a person or a family, gets a card. These cards are stacked like the library cards and the card file catalogs you have, and it's very easy to update them, to retrieve them, to do statistics with them. So once you have a card system, you're not throwing away your lowest level of data collection, but you're keeping it, you update it, right? People can get new cards, you can replace them, you can write new ones, you can attach a second one. There's all kinds of things you can do. And they discover that it really works to update and not just do statistics, but track people, find people, right? The Wehrmacht has this enormous, I spent years in these archives. They have this enormous, it's in a building where you cannot see the end of the aisle, the hallway, right? The earth, I don't know. I've never managed to get to the end of it. And they created 100 million entries, and they were able to manage it, right? They were able to very efficiently trace soldiers and place soldiers on an individual level, with a data stream coming in from all the local branches of the Army personnel management, and orders going out to allocate the resources. And it worked until April 1945, right? So you see them do the last orders and entries and everything, and in terms of medals, they went well into to the end of May 1945. They just kept doing it, right? Stopping a bureaucracy is so hard, right? So the big difference to anything before is that these new systems, combining indices, lists, personnel files, etc., makes data handling, not just in recording and not just in doing statistics, but in getting data to base your decision making on. It just works, right? And this is not the early Hollerith machines, right? That we are very much focused. This is very basic index card stuff that works the same way that it works in the early modern period. They just apply it in a different way.
That's why Linnaeus used playing cards to organize his taxonomy.
Quick comment. Working with U.S. censuses, the great problem was record linkage from one census to another. And what your index system has done that work for you. I mean,
Yeah.
Hey, that's pretty handy.
Don't get me started on record linkage.
Well, it's the challenge with census.
It is. One of the first large data projects I did, fresh out after getting my PhD, I convinced the German Research Foundation to give me money to do a data project. We got samples from all the major repositories on individual level data on the German armed forces in the Nazi period. And we tried to demonstrate that you could actually link the central personnel file, the lists of decorations, the lists of losses, of missing soldiers, et cetera, et cetera. So we took 5 or 6 samples from very large data stacks, digitized them, and demonstrated that data linkage was possible, and you could get an even fuller picture on individuals that really left very little other traces. And we're now working with the Arlsen archives. They have this central index of the victims of Nazi persecution. It's 45 million cards. And the hardest thing to do, really, because it comes from so many different sources, where all kinds of clerks wrote down names from all over Europe, that linking the data is really I mean, 45,000, you can't do it by hand, right? You have to come up with something that helps you actually get the data together. But record linkage was done on a mass basis in the post-1945 period. The humanitarian work to find missing people, children separated from their parents, the whole resettlement and relocation of the displaced persons was done to a large degree by matching different indices by hand. So these massive indices, like about 30 to 40,000 cards in the central index of missing people. You can imagine hallways full of women and men, some men, mostly women, spending literally years matching cards hand by hand to reunite families and to clarify where people were lost. So these systems, when they grow large, the German Labor Administration had a central index on all the guest workers. I actually tried to get that one, and they said, oh, when we were done with recruiting, we destroyed it. But we put it on microfilm first. I said, oh, sure, give me the microfilm. Well, the last thing we know is somebody put it in the brown closet in the main hallway, gone. But this central index was operated by 4,000 people. 4,000 people to enter data and retrieve data. So when the Labor Department said, who's in Germany, who do we need to hire, where do we do recruiting? They were actually able to not just do one statistics in a 12-month period. They would send 1,000 people in to retrieve data and come up with an answer. So it's like a living computer.
Just curious, this is for a very, very different topical. Thanks, Vera. This is a curiosity question. In terms of your methodology, did you get any inspiration from Wrigley and Schofield's population history of England and Wales? Not with respect to the issue of migration, but strictly speaking, because there is a very strong formal correspondence between what you begin with, the reconstruction, and of course what they're doing is parish reconstruction, tracing that, of course they were tracing it over long periods of time and so forth, but it is quite amazing what they were able to do with the information that they had in coming to the conclusions. So I'm just curious whether there was any sort of inspiration from that direction.
Anybody who knows me longer in Eugene, ask my students, knows that it's very important not to get me started telling interesting stories from my research. When we trace individuals, like I did in this talk in the beginning, this is what we sometimes do. This is very, if you will, conventional prosopographic genealogical work. And I think it's important because you can actually bring people back into history that are not there, right? They weren't interviewed, they didn't leave diaries or letters or anything. And even though we're only seeing them through the eyes of the administration, I think we can, reading against the grain, we can also get an idea about, some aspects of these migrants or people's lives. And it is actually amazing to what degree we can trace victims of the Shoah, displaced persons around the world. We're now having a massive project where we trace people going to Venezuela after the war. And then following them, as they integrate and transform the society of Venezuela. For us, it's very important to go from monitoring small groups to monitoring larger groups. This is why record linkage is so important. And what we do in Germany is really, we're really not early movers, again, even in my research. If you look at the Netherlands or at England, they're so far ahead in digitizing, say, parish data, and then linking it. And that comes from exact this social history you're mentioning. But, like the US, I might point out, everybody takes a wrong turn. Because you have these very important sources, little data points on individuals, and as you put them together, you see, a family, a biography, right? Many archives, the National Archives in the United States as well, let in commercial services to digitize the data. And that means, what are they called? Family tree in something, ancestry? They come in, they say, we'll digitize that whole lot for you, and we'll do character recognition. All you have to allow us is to charge people in the end to get access. And that results in genealogists being super happy because you pay $16 a month. I was tempted yesterday, $16 a month, and you can get, for instance, the casualty lists of the Confederate Army. One name by one name by one name, and you keep doing that. And there is virtually no way to get the data set. And the archive has signed the data set away. Oh, I can get it from Ancestry for $75 zillion in gold coin, right? So data from public archives goes into commercial handling and is being commodified. And that's fine for everybody researching their history, but we've, for instance, we've worked with a data set that has every soldier from the Ottoman army killed in the Battle of Gallipoli, right? I tried to do the same with the Australians, the Brits, etc. And each data set, except for, I think, New Zealand, was already commodified. So there's no way to accessing the data until you pay, and when you pay, you get one data set at the time. And this is all wrong, because it serves some purposes, but it stands in the way of, you know, public history, not in the sense of public history, but of, you know, history for the public, right? Academic research. That's a problem. So what we do on a very small scale, right? I get some projects, we digitize some stuff, we do some work, but it's very important that we digitize that material and then put that material back in the public hands, in the archives. Because one thing I'm absolutely sure about is I am not the person with the smartest question, right? So all we do needs to get back into public hands, because there's going to be generations probably of historians doing more interesting things with it. So it cannot be commodified, and that's exactly what's happening. And that's why, you know, don't get me started, that's why it's so important that places like the Arolsen archives, we worked with them for quite a while, they were the first archive that went massively digital. And they are not bound by national data protection laws or because they're an international institution. And they were approached by what do you call fantasy.com family ancestry, and they said, you know, literally the victims of the Shoah, that's good business. We digitize everything, we do all, and you just sign it over to us. And they were smart enough with their new director to say no, and say, well, we may just be able to do all of that in 20 years, but we're not going to sign over these sources to commodification, right? And this needs to be replicated, right? And especially in the United States, where you have pretty much undisturbed data, right? You haven't lost that much sources than we have. You have your census data, you have